Senator Rausch. Thank you very much to coming to the Needham channel and talk to me about this session. And with the formal session over this week, Governor just signed into law several bills. So tell me about them.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure to be here with you and the other folks here at the Needham channel. It was indeed a very busy end of session. We got many bills across the finish line, and all the way across the finish line with the governor having signed them. And then there were some other things that didn't quite make it all the way. But among the things that the governor most recently signed into law, the climate, green energy and climate legislation, that was a huge bill, landmark legislation, setting, frankly, a national standard on offshore wind and greener, better buildings and ratepayer protections, and really significantly shifting our transit systems from fossil fuels into electric. So that is a massive, massive bill. Earlier in the session, we passed robust reproductive and gender-affirming care legislation. That bill was really critical. I was really proud that many of the pieces of policy that I had filed at various different points throughout this session and even throughout last session were incorporated into that final package, including making reproductive rights an actual personal right and providing people a pathway to enforce those rights if anybody violates them or interferes with them. Also addressing abortion and birth care deserts in our Commonwealth, and protecting the rights and the laws and the access that we already have here in the Commonwealth, which we passed last term by virtue of the Roe Act, which, in fact, that bill, the governor did veto, and we overrode it twice, actually, to make that a law in the Commonwealth, so that when the Dobbs decision came out, people in Massachusetts were already protected by virtue of that lawmaking that we did in the last term. Right. So the bill that we passed this term, that the governor did sign into law, which is terrific, really protects the advancements that we made last session, and makes a couple of important clarifications. Some of my clarifying work actually served as a pillar of the compromise between the two chambers. So really proud to keep leading on that. And there's also significant more work to be done in the space of really making sure that nobody already in the Bay State or coming to the Bay State to access reproductive health care need worry about being able to actually get physical or mental health care related to pregnancy. So many forward steps made, many more steps still to come. And I think that's the same also on election reform legislation, which we passed. The Senate actually passed it back in October of last year. The House followed suit, in January. And then that compromise was sent to the governor's desk in June, and the governor did sign it. So folks have probably already received their postcard to be able to request a mail-in ballot for the upcoming elections this year. That's really important. Many important pieces still to come, like paid time off for voting, which most other states in the country have. Massachusetts still doesn't. Mandatory ballot box drop box ratios. Needham, we have that big red one that's right outside of Town Hall. In other places, with more voting people, just bigger populations, they had real trouble in 2020 being able to actually access a drop box to put their ballot into, and we all know that mail can be slow, so that is certainly an important piece that still needs to get done, and really addressing some of that, the inequities that we continue to see in access to our voting systems. And in fact, while we've passed robust legislation, unfortunately, some pieces of that legislation still have not actually been implemented, including a piece that would have created an online portal for you to go and request your mail-in ballot online, right? Lots of people lose that postcard and might come up on the deadline quickly. And so they need that online access to be able to get their mail-in ballot. But unfortunately, the Secretary of the Commonwealth has refused to implement that part of the law, even though it is actually required by law. And there are a few other pieces that are not actually being implemented. So we are, I am in particular focusing on making sure that not only are the pieces that we already passed actually being implemented, but also we have much more work to do on that front as well. Some other things that we've done this session that are completely done across the finish line: sports betting. That's been a really important focal point for a lot of people. Sports betting is now legal in Massachusetts. The implementation is going to take a little bit of time, but that process has already started. Really robust mental health legislation to improve significantly access to mental health care throughout the state, including insurance coverage, which is of course a really big deal. This something called the SPEED Act. This is to help our military families and veterans, including the folks who are relocating here while they're on active duty, to help spouses get more streamlined and easier access to jobs, and especially jobs for which you need a license, right? If they're licensed in another state and they move here because that's where their service takes them, we want them to be able to get up and running. It's really a sort of signature piece of legislation that we passed this term that is being held up kind of nationally as sort of a standard setter. So that's a terrific one that we got done. And we also passed a Judiciary IT bond bill. It improves our information technology infrastructure in our judiciary. I had a critical piece in there that ensures that mental health counselors that are providing mental health care for survivors of sexual violence at rape crisis centers, that those conversations actually stay confidential. Our law had kind of fallen behind the times in the development of that profession, so we needed to catch up the law. And so that was a piece that I put in there. And so lots of work that my team and I have done over the last however many months it was, many months this term, year and a half, getting up to that end of formal session. July 31st ran into the morning of August 1st, a marathon 23-hour legislative session. It was very tiring, but we did get all of those things across the finish line. And then, of course, there are the pieces that we didn't quite get done, that were distinctly disappointing. A few for me, in particular the economic development bill. Right.
We can, before we go into that,
sure, yeah.
I want to just to tell me a little bit more details about some of the bills. So you mentioned the IT bond bills. Does that also include the changes of some of the languages in our gun reform?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep, that bill. So we got another Supreme Court decision called the Bruin decision. That also came out not too long ago, and so we needed to reform our gun violence prevention laws in Massachusetts to conform to the decision that the Supreme Court issued. So those tweaks are in there, and the governor has signed that, at least in part, into law. There is significantly more work to be done to ensure that Massachusetts stays one of the leading states in the country in terms of preventing gun violence. We have to address ghost guns. We have to address more robust data reporting. We have significant pieces that that don't inhibit people's access to arms for purposes of sport or hunting, right? Things that have been going on for quite a long time, but that really prevent the heinous gun violence that we are seeing in other parts of the country.
Right. Talking about the climate and energy policy bills, we also set goals to our 2050 climate goals. So how does this suit that goal?
Yeah, it's a great question. So last session, we passed by significant majority what we called the roadmap bill, the climate roadmap bill, that set these specific climate goals for us to achieve by 2050. And if we're going to get serious about meeting those goals, we have to pass legislation like the one we just passed. So a big portion of it is on transportation, right? Our transportation sector is one of the biggest contributors to carbon emissions and to pollution in our planet, so the planet deterioration through climate change and those fossil fuels reliance. So there are many pieces in there to support greening our transportation systems, right? Not just public transportation, but also private vehicles. Charging stations for electric cars, for example, is part of that bill. I put a piece into that bill on school buses, right? Everybody, you've seen the school bus, you see the plume of, gross, smoke that comes out of the tailpipe. That's because school buses rely on diesel fuel. So it's actually kind of complicated in Massachusetts to shift our school buses statewide from diesel to electric. So I filed an amendment to the climate bill when it came to the Senate floor, and that amendment was adopted and it was preserved in the bill that the governor just signed. So it is now law to start the process of figuring out how to shift our school buses from diesel to electric, because we know that that is important not only to protect our planetary health, but also for the personal health of our children, right? And our school bus drivers, right? People shouldn't be breathing that stuff in all the time. And air pollution is a significant cause of asthma, for example. And we see it continue to rise as a social determinant of health, where we have populations that are continually exposed to worse air pollution. And so we need to address that. And actually, one of the pieces of our state that is one of our biggest contributors to carbon pollution are buildings, particularly big buildings. And this is Massachusetts. It's a really old state. A lot of our big buildings, the really big ones, have already been built. And so we have laws on the books. Up until now, we have had laws on the books about new construction or substantial renovation, but we haven't had any laws at all on the books about curbing carbon emissions from existing large buildings. So very proud to work with a sort of group of folks, experts and advocates called the Better Buildings Coalition, to pass my legislation within the climate bill to make better buildings, specifically focusing on mandating reporting of energy use and emissions from those existing large buildings, because we just can't mitigate what we don't measure. So with these provisions, we'll have the measurements, and then we can figure out how to best mitigate them and set standards for energy, carbon emission reductions and energy efficiencies for those existing large buildings. So those are just some of the pieces in that climate legislation.
Right. And also there's a bill that will affect people who involved in the marijuana industry, the cannabis policy reform. So tell me a little bit about that.
The governor signed that one yesterday as well. So this is really an equity bill. We've seen pretty significant inequities play out in the cannabis industry, and what that legislation does is provide fixes, right? Provide steps to really boost business owners of color in particular in the cannabis industry to have better supports, better access to grants, to make sure that we are kind of equalizing that field.
Can we talk about this $11 billion, I think, transportation infrastructure bill? It's going to be invested in to address some safety issues of MBTA and the expansion of East-West Rail. Just tell me a little bit more details of how this money will be spent.
Right, so the transportation bill is a bond bill, so all of those dollars are bond authorizations. Right, so just want to sort of draw that distinction between, say, the budget. Right, the budget is a direct allocation of money from our general fund. Bond bills provide an authorization, and then there's a number of other steps that you have to take in order to actually get those funds. But it's a significant sum of money, and I hope that those bond authorizations will come through the executive or through the governor, whoever he or she may be, at the time when the money is sought. Certainly, the MBTA and the commuter rail need significant improvements. I have to say, I question whether that is. I doubt that is a. I would say I even disagree that is purely an issue of money. Every time the governor has come and asked for money, at least since I've been in office, the legislature has provided that money. So this is not, certainly there is an additional need for additional funds, and we've got that in part in this transportation bond bill, in part coming in through other investments that we've made in our transportation system, and hopefully in part through the Fair Share Act, which is on everyone's ballot in November, that would provide additional funding directly into both education and transportation. But really, the MBTA and the commuter rail is a question of leadership and management, such that trains are catching on fire and people are jumping out of windows. I mean, that is ridiculously unacceptable. So my colleagues who are leading the Transportation Committee in the legislature just recently held an oversight hearing and continue to kind of hold the governor's feet to the fire on safety and efficacy and reliability of our public transportation systems. Specifically for our district, right, Needham and the other towns that I represent, that transportation bond bill contains, millions of dollars for investments in local projects. And those are really important to boost our local transportation supports.
Roads and like those local infrastructures too. Right.
And also, here in Needham, we did work to secure funding to think about and investigate, alternate forms of transportation that we might be able to provide here in town, different from a car, right? And that's part of that local and state partnership that we have with, between those of us in the state government, myself and Representative Garlick, and partnering with our folks in local government here in Needham and throughout the entirety of my district to make sure we continue to deliver those real results that really make an impact, a positive impact in people's lived experiences.
Right. All right, now let's talk about the one that did not get passed, and some people might be a little disappointed of it got stalled because I know that it has something to do with a tax rebate law back in 1986, but we can go back to that later. But first, just to fill me in with what were included in this bill.
In the economic development bill.
Right.
So, the chair of Ways and Means on the Senate side called this bill the kitchen sink bill. This bill had droves of pieces in it, everything from investing in hospitals and hospitals that are still trying to emerge from COVID and still grappling with costs and other sorts of issues that really stemmed from COVID. And now we've got monkeypox, and just this morning we're seeing polio show up in the wastewater in New York City, which is not so far from here, right? We have a health, both a sort of personal medical health care and a public health infrastructure problem. And we need to make policy that addresses that and fixes it, improves it, and we also need to invest more money in it. And so the economic development bill had significant money going into the hospitals. It is still in play. It's not past tense. There were $17 million to support abortion access funds and to provide money for people to access reproductive health care and provide that reproductive health care. Investment in early education, tens of millions of dollars in early education. And that's all on top of sort of over and above the millions of dollars for local projects and priorities, not just in our district, but throughout the state. So it's a really significant bill, right? Healthcare investments, childcare investments, and that's to say nothing also, not only the local projects on top of it, but also tax relief is in that bill, right? I actually filed a budget amendment to the fiscal 23 budget back in May that was the first iteration of putting money back into people's pockets, right? People have been feeling the pinch at the pump for a long time, for example. As gas prices, we're finally starting to see them come down, which is terrific, but people have been feeling that pinch for a long time. So I filed a budget amendment back in May to give people money right back into your pocket. I don't want to put it in the pocket of the oil company executives. I want to put it in your pocket, and provide people with checks that, that sort of laid the foundation for one of the pieces that was in the economic development bill that would have provided people with $250 or $500 checks, to kind of weather this financial period a little bit easier. The estate tax reform was in there, and several other pieces are all in that bill.
And now came the law.
Yeah, it's in my opinion, the law is the law. It was passed on a ballot initiative. If the law says, if the money comes back and the counting comes back saying we've hit the limit. If we've hit that and people are due money by virtue of that law, then people should get their money back.
Right.
And that did kind of upend the negotiations.
But the fact that it emerged that right at the end of towards the end of the session and kind of like threw off the budget off a little bit.
I'm not actually on the leadership of the Senate side, and I'm not in the House, so I'm not in sort of the level of analysis and conversation about that or the negotiations to get that resolution. So I can't really speak to, what happened, other than the absence of a negotiated deal, a compromise between the two chambers is so deeply disappointing and frustrating. That money, it's not only direct money, but also more bond authorizations. I hope that we come back into formal session at some point in the next couple of months to finish that bill, and take a vote on it. All those bond authorizations, we actually have to take a vote on, because we need a 2/3 vote in order to authorize bonding. And we can only do that if we're voting on the record. We can't vote on the record in an informal session. So we will have to come back in for a special session in order to vote on those pieces. The rest of it could, in theory, go through in an informal session, but any one legislator can come and hold it up, because those are the rules. That's how that particular portion of our legislating works. So it's a massive bill. The fact that it didn't get done before we closed formal session on August 1st was deeply disappointing and very frustrating, I think, for everybody. I share that disappointment and frustration, and I really hope that we come back in to get it finished.
All right, are there any other highlights from this session that you want to bring attention to?
I want to uplift a particular bill called the I Am bill. This is a bill that would address period poverty throughout the state and provide menstrual products for free in schools and homeless shelters and prisons throughout the state. And I uplift it because the Senate actually passed it unanimously, and unfortunately the House didn't take it up at all. But also because there was tremendous youth advocacy around that bill. No surprise, right? This is an issue that, people who menstruate who are in high school, they're impacted by this. And a lot of that advocacy work actually came from young people in our district. And they met with me and we talked and tried to help them and lift them up as much as possible. And I was so proud to take that vote, that yes vote on the I Am bill in the Senate. We took it many months ago, and I was really sad that the House didn't take that up at all. Another piece that the Senate passed that the House didn't take up is on reforming our early education sector. Right, this is a sector that nearly collapsed at the onset of COVID. It is a near totally private sector, and so it's not like public education, right, K-12 public education, where the government can more readily sort of infuse support into that system, because the K-12 is public and early education is almost entirely private. So the Senate passed a bill that would really shore up our early education system, not make it fully public, but provide much stronger infrastructure. I think we can all readily see that childcare is infrastructure, right? If kids are sick, the parents don't go to work. If the parents don't go to work, the business can't continue, right? I mean, we can see this as a much more readily able to see this post-COVID. We're not really post-COVID, but as we continue to manage our way through hopefully the tail end of COVID.
Right.
And then there were some pieces that both chambers did pass, but still didn't get across the finish line, which happens. But a pretty significant piece of public health infrastructure legislation that would have really boosted local public health. Both chambers passed that bill, and the governor rejected large portions of it. So at this stage of the game, I think it's effectively dead, which is really, really disappointing. Our local public health, our boards of health, and local public health nurses have been saying for 2.5 years in particular, as we've been dealing with COVID, but even long before that, that they need supports and funding and better coordination from the state, and to be able to provide, say, herd immunity and supports for access to vaccines and other kinds of public health protocols that we need. They've been saying for a long time how much they need these systemic improvements from the state level, and the legislature delivered, and unfortunately the governor rejected large swaths of that bill. We also passed a Public Lands Protection Act that both chambers passed slightly different versions on, and the negotiations on that one also broke down. And then there's some pieces that we didn't, that didn't pass either chamber, like plastics reduction, right? Going back to climate, I'm the chair of the environmental committee. Plastics are really significant contributors to climate change, right? Plastic production relies on fossil fuels. Less than 10% of the plastics that we see every day, no matter how much you put in the recycle bin, actually get recycled. If we're serious about meeting those 2050 climate goals, we have to address plastics. And that's not just plastic bags. It's, forks and knives and cups and, plastic nip bottles and all single-use plastics, right? Because they are polluting our waters and ending up in landfills, and we're even seeing microplastics show up in people's bloodstreams. Addressing plastics is a really significant piece of the work that I've been doing this term. As the chair of the Joint Committee on the Environment, Natural Resources, and Agriculture, and unfortunately we did not see robust legislation on plastic reduction get to the floor of either chamber. So that is one of my top priorities going into next session. That having been said, I did pass legislation to create the first ever statewide car seat recycling program, which, as a parent myself, we're still in car seats. And I think every parent out there would agree, car seats use a lot of plastic. And there are 12 or 13 other states that already have statewide car seat recycling. Massachusetts is not one of them, but we will be now because I was able to pass that bill.
Now with the formal session over, when will the body reconvene? And is there anything else that you want to share with us that you think people can anticipate from the next round?
Sure. So again, we are the formal sessions, unless we come in for a special session, which is possible but difficult. The formal sessions of the legislature are now concluded. So that means that basically any substantive legislation will need to be refiled in January in the next legislative term, right? That's after the November elections when the new legislature gets sworn in, and we start the process all over again. I happen to love that process, and I love that people are reaching out now, advocates and experts and grassroots organizers and just, people who live lives and are, seeing an issue, and they come to us with a suggestion, and we say, oh, what can we do with that suggestion in terms of making policy or providing funding that can address that particular problem. And so we're having those conversations now to prepare for next term. And in that sort of filing period that we have in January, it's the first 2 weeks of January. That's when nearly all of the bills get filed. So it's a very exciting time, but it also means that you need to prepare in advance. So we're doing that prep now, and we'll be doing that prep for the duration of this calendar year.
Okay.
And we've actually been able to generate some really significant results from that process already, just from listening. One of the things that I was really worried about actually earlier in this term was that we were not hearing from young people. And I'm a mom, one of only 2 moms of kids under 10 in the entirety of the Senate, and I said, we're not hearing from our youth. We need to hear from our youth. What's going on for them? They're all stuck at home. I mean, we're all stuck at home, right? But how is this impacting our young people? I started having a legislative forum, like a town hall style forum. We did it virtually. We called it Student Speak. And in the very first session of Student Speak, we had dozens of young people come and talk to us. And we had the grown-ups. The grown-ups wanted to come, and we said, nope, you're not allowed to come. It's just for young people, for teens in the district. And they came and they spoke so bravely with me and my staff about their mental health needs, and how the current systems that provide some mental health support weren't working for them. And my staff and I, we finished that first session with them pretty late at night, 8:30 maybe, and we got right back into another meeting, my team and I, to say, all right, what are we going to do? And 3 weeks later, we had provided $250,000 for a pilot program for a youth mental health support text line. So we said, how can we possibly meet people where they are, right, youngsters where they are, to provide confidential, anonymous, peer-to-peer support? And the answer was through texting, right? And so we partnered with Samaritans, which is a long-standing mental health support organization in Massachusetts to provide this line that is now called Hey Sam, that is up and running. And I'm so proud that not only did we secure that initial seed funding in the last year's budget of $250,000, this year's budget, that program is fully funded at $1 million, right, to provide peer-to-peer mental health support for youth all throughout the state just by sending a text. So I hope that any young person who's listening to this interview or watching this interview, if you ever want to talk, I hope that they will text Hey Sam and find a compassionate virtual ear or a set of fingers, I suppose, on the other line, on the other side of that line, right? So that's something, and that tracks with a lot of the kind of revolutionized support that we've provided for people all throughout the district, particularly through COVID, because we had to get creative. We couldn't just go and meet in person like this. So we started having virtual office hours, which we're still doing, which has drastically increased access because people don't have to figure out how to drive to meet me somewhere. We've been having senior coffee hours in senior centers all across the district, and really kind of engaging folks and meeting folks where they are so that we can listen as best as we can, as closely as we can, to try to figure out where to either invest money or make a policy shift. And on the policy shift side, I launched this term, a Small Business Advisory Council. Right, our small businesses have been among the hardest hit during COVID, and so we brought together people who are living it, right? People who are running their businesses and trying to figure out how to stay afloat. Some people who had businesses that had started before the pandemic, some that actually came up in the midst of the pandemic, and trying to find, listen carefully and find where the problem points are that we can provide some kind of solution for. And in fact, I was able to pass some of their policy solutions in that economic development bill, right? And so we want to see those supports for small businesses come through in that final package. So, we're hard at work, continue to be hard at work.
Right.
I know there's sort of maybe an idea out there that everyone in the legislature is on vacation from now until December. That is, at least for me, that is not true. We are still hard at work, still, out in the district listening to people, trying to be as helpful as we can and find good resolutions as we also continue to prepare on the policy side to file all those bills again at the beginning of next term.
All right. That's a great talk. Thank you.
Thank you
for being here and talking to me.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.